Hello and welcome back to a brand new DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you're all doing well. Thank you, as always, for being here. It's great to have you along for a bit of F1 chat and discussion. And of course, we are reviewing the Singapore Grand Prix. And history was made in the F1 season. Not for the first time this season, but we have a different winner. Max Verstappen's era of domination, I'm sure, will continue in the long haul. But for now, has ended. We have a new winner, and it was Carlos Sainz for Ferrari. An incredible performance this weekend for Carlos, getting it on pole position and consolidating the win with an incredible 400 IQ play, but a dramatic finish it was as the Mercedes boys ran them very, very close. But of course, we're going to be talking about that in more detail with the DNF1 panel tonight. We have Courtney Pine and Lee Wannington. Courtney, I'm going to come to you first, mate. How are you, and what did you make of the Singapore Grand Prix? Some fans dubbing it the race of the season. Do you agree with that?
On the 11th day of... Not tonight, my friends!
No,
not tonight!
You can't sing that. Not tonight.
Look.
The streak is over for now, at least. It's probably going to continue onwards, but for now, we're going to be talking about something other than a Max Verstappen perfection.
So, I personally think it's a great weekend for the sport. This is where I need to calm down, because this is when I'll get the people after me. I think it's a great weekend for the sport. Not taking anything away from the efforts on Red Bull since last season, but we needed a new winner. We needed some new challenges, and we're seeing these battles between the likes of Ferrari, McLaren, Aston Martin, Mercedes for the majority of the season, and it's something I've been saying for most of the season that, again, not taking anything away from them, but if Red Bull weren't so dominant, we would have been seeing a lot of great battles for race victories, and we finally got to see that this weekend. So this weekend has really given me an appetite to really hope that a couple of teams that I've just mentioned will really up their game and give us more of this. Could you imagine the championship battle we'd have next season with all those teams?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, as you rightly put, a lot of respect has to be put on this era of dominance that we've been witnessing with Max Verstappen and Red Bull. I mean, you have to go far back as Brazil last season. For the last time a non-Red Bull driver won a Grand Prix in Formula One, let alone try and win a championship or anything like that. And, to see this race play out the way that it did, I mean, there was always that threat that Red Bull always carried with them, especially in Max's hands, that, with the strategy that they played, if things would go their way, if there's a safety car at the right time, it brings Max back into the equation. But in fairness to the lead drivers like Sainz, Leclerc, Hamilton, Russell, Norris, of course, the Red Bulls were never really a factor this weekend at all. So I think we got a great opportunity to see what I think some of us have been suggesting as to why the midfield battle, or at least the battle behind Max Verstappen, has been very exciting when you look in the finer details. And we got to see a prime example of how that would have looked today if Max Verstappen wasn't really in the equation at all. And that's not to say that F1 is better without him. Absolutely not. F1 is a richer sport with the best drivers in the best cars fighting it out. But it was very nice to... I think it was very nice to watch a race this weekend where you were glued from the first lap to the last. And look, let's not kid ourselves here. It wasn't the most exciting race at certain points. I think there was a lot of time where we had to be patient, a lot of strategic elements going on to try and lengthen out these stints. But overall, I think we can all agree it was a very dramatic finish, and that's kind of what you want. That finale that really is the cherry on the top of a very delicious cake. Lee, I'm going to come to you as well. What are your thoughts on this race?
I would sum it up with, this is classic F1. This is one of the reasons why I love the sport, is just the intrigue regarding the strategy, the teams, the potential. Will this happen? Can they do this? And it was just a classic F1 race this season. We had but even before the race, we had a four-way team fight for pole position. Who will do it? Who won't? Will it be Ferrari? Will it be McLaren? Will it be Mercedes? Will Fernando pull something magical out of his repertoire, which we all know he has that in his skill? Obviously, Red Bull wasn't part of that conversation, but still, 4 teams. That's very impressive to be just for a pole position fight. And then the race are the 3-team fight for the win. And will Max may come back after he switched onto the mediums? He was storming through the field, and he nearly had Charles. So it's like, oh, what a if just that's what if safety car? But it was such a juicy race as well. And I would just finish it off. You could argue, arguably one of Carlos's finest wins in Formula One.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I said this with people I was watching the race with. Not that there are many wins that you can throw to Carlos Sainz, but of course. But it was, in my opinion, without doubt, his best performance in Formula One. Carlos Sainz has always been quick. He's always been consistent. He's always been reliable to a large degree. In his Ferrari days, we've probably seen that more often as he's become more comfortable and accustomed to this team. But in terms of being able to handle that level of pressure from start to finish and the way the race changed, the dynamic elements of the safety car, Mercedes switching things up with that tactical strategic change, which of course nearly won them the race, and what he did towards the end to make sure he was able to defend his position and consolidate that result was incredibly impressive, and I think massive kudos need to go to him. But of course, whilst we're on the subject of Carlos Sainz, guys, I mean, what were your thoughts on that? Do you agree? Was it Sainz's best performance in his F1 career?
Oh, absolutely. If you think about how Carlos managed that race from the very beginning, he managed that race like you'd expect a Lewis Hamilton, a Max Verstappen, or Fernando Alonso, who have got so many race wins, have been multiple championship battles. And I think it's one thing winning a race, but to manage it the way he did was truly impressive. And I think it's a reminder of where Carlos Sainz can sometimes lack raw pace compared to Charles Leclerc. I really do believe he's got a fantastic strategic brain on him, which I feel really helped him get over the line this weekend. And he also factored in Ferrari's biggest Achilles heel in recent years, which has been tyre management. So, he didn't get carried away with the pole position. He knew there was plenty of work to be done. So, really, really, truly impressed by Carlos Sainz. And obviously, the British bias in me would have loved to have seen Lando Norris, George Russell, or Lewis Hamilton win. But you have to say, Carlos Sainz deserved that win. If George Russell had managed to get past Carlos Sainz, I would have been gutted for him, because I think the effort that he put in today was race win worthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we go back to the British Grand Prix last year that Carlos Sainz won from pole position as well, of course, as he did today. And I'm sure some people would have looked back on that race and probably thought there was an element of fortune that allowed Sainz to get the win on that particular day rather than his teammate, who some people probably felt should have won that race. Today, there was absolutely no luck whatsoever for Carlos Sainz. He absolutely handled it like a champ. And Lee, do we need to start putting more respect on Carlos Sainz's name? Because this is a guy who started out his Ferrari career with some potential and hope and optimism that he would be a very solid driver, not necessarily with that star power that Charles Leclerc currently has, but in all honesty, if Charles Leclerc had won this race today, driving exactly the same way that Carlos Sainz did, we'd all be going mad over it. We'd all be saying, this is exactly why Charles Leclerc is up there with the likes of Verstappen, Hamilton and Alonso. So should we start putting more respect on Carlos Sainz's name for being able to put together a performance like that?
Personally, for me, I've always had great respect for Carlos. I think he's a brilliant driver, and you've seen glimpses of his ability in his times at Toro Rosso, Renault and McLaren. And Ferrari hasn't helped because of the being Ferrari, but you saw it today. But I think overall, as the fan base, I think he's quite. He's not thought of as highly as Charles, obviously, and that's a disservice on Carlos, because he is. All the drivers in Formula One are world class. Don't get me wrong, but Carlos is definitely not all in the same category as Charles, and I think he showed him why he should not be considered number two at Ferrari. He should be an equal number one, given the opportunity to fight to lead that team forward. And I know, obviously, the Fred Vasseur was brought in to calm Charles and give him hope from the future, and Ferrari has the right plan. But Carlos is there, and he has just as much talent. Maybe not the pace, as Courtney said, but he's got such a sharp mind on him as a driver. And speaking to the Speaking to the Ferrari engineers, they seemed confused when he was letting Lando in the DRS window. Like, he's in the window. You want to move on? I was like, no, this is the plan. Don't worry. This is all good. And obviously, the result followed.
I absolutely loved that part of the race. Honestly, when the Mercedes were coming, they were chipping away 1.5 seconds, 2 seconds a lap, and then it got to the point where I'm thinking they may do this, both of them. You know, they could win this race because they were that much faster. And then, of course, we got to that point where they caught that Lando and Carlos, and yeah, Lando was getting dangerously close, but I think what was brilliant about Carlos Sainz, and it's that strategical brain that he really has, that I think is massively underrated when you consider all the attributes of these drivers, what Carlos, you know, how intelligent he is as a driver, and his racecraft as well, something Fernando Alonso is very famous for also in that regard. So there are some hallmarks there between the two. The fact that he knew Ferrari's strengths. He knew it was fast in the straights. He knew that it would have to take something incredible to overtake them in a straight line with DRS, and being able to use that to allow Lando close enough so that he could get the DRS to protect him from the Mercedes duo behind them. For me, 400 IQ play, probably one of the smartest, most brilliant pieces of defensive driving you will see this season. And I think we saw in that moment when Lando and George were fighting each other, if that goes the other way and George Russell manages to complete that move on Lando, he wins the Grand Prix. Sainz probably doesn't have enough to defend from him with the tyre advantage that Russell has over him at that time. But to be able to pull that off and get the result, absolutely incredible stuff from Carlos Sainz. And I think it moves us over to the other side of the garage with Charles Leclerc by comparison. And I don't want to say that Charles Leclerc didn't have a good day. I would say I think he did have a good weekend, all things considered. It could have been more for him, but I think in comparison to his teammates' performance, it was very much about a weekend of fine margins. You know, we go back to qualifying, Charles Leclerc making a mistake at the penultimate corner where he loses a tenth here, and that cost him pole position potentially. And in the race, in the wrong place at the wrong time, after that double stacking with Ferrari, and he gets caught out because Hamilton is in the way. Not, you know, Lewis doesn't do anything deliberately to obstruct him. It's just wrong place, wrong time, and it bogs him all the way down. And you know, that is a sport of fine margins. If things had gone a bit more in Leclerc's favour, maybe he wins this race today. But overall, guys, a solid weekend for Ferrari, but some thoughts as well for Charles Leclerc, perhaps.
Yeah, we Charles.
Bit... Sorry, Leg.
No, go on.
No, you go. Sorry.
Okay.
This is what happens when I don't tee it up. It's to me, to you.
No, I was going to say with Charles, obviously it was a solid drive, but Ferrari started the race with split strategy. Obviously the perfect world of split strategies, they're both great, you both win, but there's a chance that one can go wrong because one is the better strategy, which happened to be in this case Charles. Although he was never on Carlos's pace all weekend, Carlos seemed to hit the sweet spot throughout the entire weekend, and he was just ready to go from the start. Obviously on a high from Monza, but not, it's obviously more than just that, but it is probably part of the reason as well. And yeah, you can't help with the pit stop, and I think obviously Charles just got taken by those Mercedes. He didn't have that rear gunner in Carlos's case in McLaren, but he had no one to defend him because he was out on his own. He was way clear of Max at that point. Obviously, Max was a few cars behind, but there was a big empty space and the Mercedes went past. It's just an unfortunate scenario, but he should hope that Ferrari have got this performance and they've got a streak and that he'll be his chance in the coming races.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you know, owing to George Russell's late accident, that promoted Charles up to P4. So it wasn't all completely lost. It was still a decent result for him. He'll be a little bit upset that he didn't get on the podium this weekend. I think the key moment in that race, perhaps, which could have swung things in the balance to Leclerc, was the fact that Ferrari decided not to gamble when that virtual safety car was called out for Ocon, and Mercedes did with both their cars. You know, looking back on it with retrospect, we could put that down to a bad decision from Ferrari, but Would you agree with that, Courtney? Leclerc was kind of at the back of that train, so if he wanted to make that pit stop or Ferrari wanted to take a gamble, they probably could have done so without any, downside, and maybe Charles Leclerc may have been on the podium or more so.
Yeah, they obviously put them on two separate strategies, which I do think was a good move by them. But I don't know. At times, I couldn't help but feel that Charles Leclerc was almost like a sacrificial lamb at times to try and hold up the opposition behind. Again, a good ploy by Ferrari. Can't blame them for doing it. But I look at that dynamic between the two drivers and how that's evolved over this season in particular. And if you used to ask anyone, who do you think the number one driver is at Ferrari last season, 2022, you say Charles Leclerc right away. But I don't know whether it's because Carlos Sainz has now settled in at Ferrari. He's playing his trade in a different way. But I don't see the hierarchy at Ferrari as clear cut as it did last season. I'm not saying there's a passing of the torch like we saw at Monza a few years ago when Leclerc was with Sebastian Vettel. But I definitely do feel there'll be conversations going on at Ferrari about the dynamic of the team because, as I stated earlier on, yes, Charles Leclerc has that raw pace. We haven't been seeing those moments of stardust as often. I do feel that last season was quite damaging to his confidence. So we're not seeing those peaks as often as we did 2 or 3 years ago. But Carlos Sainz, with the way that his confidence has improved, with the mindset that he's having in these kind of situations, you can't help but feel that Carlos Sainz, let's say that it was Max Verstappen against Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, of course, for the season, I'd be willing to hedge my bets on Carlos Sainz. And that might sound like a bad take for some, but I feel he'd be making the choices and have the mentality to get the results over the line more consistently compared to Charles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, looking back this season, Ferrari probably have the closest driver lineup in terms of outright performance when you consider all the attributes of anyone on the grid. I don't think many people will argue that. Probably the second strongest lineup on the grid behind Russell and Hamilton. And on weekends like this, you can argue that Ferrari, it's probably very close between those two in that regard. But I think it's one of those things with Carlos Sainz at the moment. His consistency is very good. Strategically, he's brilliant. You may not have the outright pace of Leclerc, but if we look at the races so far following the summer break, only Max Verstappen has scored more points than Carlos Sainz at this point. So the upturn in form is good for him. The upturn in form is very good for Ferrari. Now, of course, 24 points, I believe, behind Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship. I'm going to put the question to you both very quickly. At one point, we were talking about the possibility of McLaren overhauling Ferrari for P4 after Silverstone. Fast forward 2 months, Ferrari, they're very much in the mix now to try and get P2 off of Mercedes. So can they do it?
Yeah, I think they can do it, to be honest. Their Ferrari have seemed to have found a sweet spot at the moment in the last few races. Obviously, that track-dependent performance can come into it, but they seem to have taken an understanding of the limitations of their car. They seem to be making less mistakes, be it strategically in the pit stop as drivers, which has been one of the Achilles heel of the Ferrari team for many years. So just ironing out those mistakes means they can potentially maximize their points. So a lot more similar to how Mercedes are being operated in the last couple of years. So it's quite easy swing, and the Ferrari can close that gap and overhaul Mercedes. It's really needed one bad race for Mercedes, like George Russell in the wall, unfortunately for George today, or having a brilliant race where Charles gets a win, Carlos gets a win, and bam, that's a massive points advantage, and there you go. Ferrari's into second. It could easily happen. There's still a lot to come of this season, and it's going to be all-out war, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And Courtney, before we started recording, you were talking to us about what we thought regarding Fred Vasseurs' influence on the team. As I said, it's still very early days into his tenure at the team, but as Lee mentioned, Ferrari, they are improving to a certain degree. Let's not get carried away, of course, because they are far from the finished article and far from a team that can definitely mount a serious championship challenge, in my opinion, car aside here. But it does look like there are certain elements to this Ferrari under Vasseur where there are starting to see some tangible improvements.
Yeah, I think if you've both hit the nail on the head, it's the Ferrari jokes are a very easy target. I think Adam, even you've joined in with the old Ferrari jokes. You're very quick to share them with us on our group chat.
I've led them.
But yeah, you spearheaded the effort. But yeah, I can't help but feel that the mess ups are becoming less frequent, and I think this race is so easy to get carried away by one race. I think you're right to say let's not get carried away just yet. The last 15 years have taught you that perfectly, Adam. But yeah, I just can't help but feel. I just can't help but feel that the decision making is improving, and the influence that he has is starting to make a difference. I think the biggest talking point has been what impact it will have on Charles Leclerc personally, and what I'm really intrigued to see is how Charles Leclerc develops as a driver, particularly if Ferrari do challenge for a championship again, because I really was disappointed on how the Ferrari Charles Leclerc challenge last season really petered away. I know the technical directive played a big part in that, but there was a lot of individual errors, not only by the team, but from Charles Leclerc himself, that made that championship a little bit too easy for Max. So, yeah, I want to be seeing, because Charles Leclerc must be, at least his mid-20s now. I think he's getting to the stage of his career now. He's getting to the stage of his career now. We really need to start putting in the results to put his name up there again. Because for me, on his day, he is up there with the likes of Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, but we haven't seen it often enough.
Yeah, very much so. Let's talk about Mercedes now, and in the end, it was a podium for Sir Lewis Hamilton. George Russell, very much in the mix, looked at one point that he could have won this Grand Prix, and it just came agonisingly to a halt after a last lap error from George where he brushes the wall in the middle sector, goes off and crashes the car. He was absolutely heartbroken and distraught. You could see in the post-race interview with Natalie Pinkham at Sky that he was completely lost for words, and after what seemed at the time to be an incredibly brave gamble, which almost turned into a master stroke of a strategy, any work that Mercedes, or any rewards that Mercedes would have been able to recruit, was massively hampered by that incident for George Russell. So I think we've got to start with him first. I mean, how are we feeling, guys, about George Russell? Are we gutted as he is, or was it just one of those that just got away from him?
Go on, mate. I'm be gutted for him with the performance he's had this weekend. He seems to have had the edge on Sir Lewis all weekend. So that was apart from the start where Lewis missed the turn one, but obviously get the place back. George was ahead of Lewis all weekend. So he had a really great race and was leading it. But unfortunately for George, he's never scored any points at Singapore, be it in his Williams or Mercedes days, and that's unfortunately carried into this year as well. It just seems to be a bit of a bogey track. He nearly made it, but it's just a really, really bad luck. Just losing a lapsing of attention and just clipping that wall just into that corner, and that was it. He got halfway alongside Lando at one stage, which was his only chance that he really got to overtaking Lando. And if he'd actually managed to complete that move, then it could be talking about George victory today. But just for him, it's a race of what could have been, unfortunately.
It does seem to be a race of fine margins. And I absolutely agree, Lee. I think the fact that Carlos Sainz did such a brilliant job with allowing Lando that DRS to help defend from the Mercedes, if Russell completes that overtake when Lando defends very hard on him, I think he goes on to win that Grand Prix. But of course, the door was slammed shut. Sainz was a bit protected, and, unfortunately for Russell, comes away with nothing. Courtney, it's a race of fine margins with George Russell, and we have seen in the past George Russell come narrowly close to certain results that have left him quite emotional, understandably. This one, for me, probably up there with some of the hardest he's probably had to experience in his entire career. Do you think this will help him going forward and try and reach that next level?
I'm starting to see quite a few parallels between George Russell and Charles Leclerc. Um, there's no doubt in the talents there. There's no doubt when they can have high peaks. But I feel just like Charles Leclerc, George Russell tends to struggle in those big moments. He seems to lack the cutting edge. Of course, this will be a learning curve for him. He can learn from it and it will make him better next time. But it was a very high pressure situation. Obviously, the conditions of the circuit. You got to remember that for 20 laps, him and Lewis were pumping in, pretty much full pace, and he found himself in a position where he was sandwiched between Lando Norris, who's actually a fantastic defensive driver. I think, a lot gets said about Lando's pace and how he is as a person. I think sometimes it's easy to forget how much of a fantastic defensive driver Lando Norris is. So he had that in front of him. And then behind him, he had one of the best drivers of all time. It was being a little bit cheeky at times. He was having a little nibble. Lewis was sending out the message to George saying, "You make a little mistake, I'm going to get you." And I feel that the pressure of that sandwich, just like two walls closing in, the pressure got too much, and he buckled in that big moment. But if George Russell does want to go on to be a world champion, he's gonna have to beat the likes of Max Verstappen. So he's gonna have to face many challenges like that in the future if he wants to reach his goal.
I think that's a really good point when you're talking about Sir Lewis Hamilton and you're comparing what he's achieved and how he's gone about it to George Russell. And you can judge it in an isolated example by this race alone, because George Russell was very much the spearhead of the Mercedes attack this weekend. I think after Friday, when things were a bit up and down, he pulled it all together like he did at Monza on the Saturday, very nearly put that Mercedes on pole position, and he was very much Carlos Sainz's biggest threat in this Grand Prix. I think we can all agree throughout from start to finish. And at the end of it, when George Russell crashes in the wall, you see his teammate, who, I'll be honest with you, despite the fact that Mercedes had a car this weekend that was capable of winning the Grand Prix, I don't think at any point I felt that Sir Lewis Hamilton was really in a serious position where he would have been able to get that result. And yet, despite that, completely, well, not flawless, because of course there was a few moments at the beginning of the race and also the move on Perez, which, people were a little bit unsure about, but of course he was able to keep that spot. That being said, didn't make any silly mistakes, didn't have any serious wobbles, was like, he's going to have a problem here or he's losing a place. Manages to do that and he still ends up P3. And it even triggers the discussion between the two drivers that in some, by some fans on social media, that if Lewis Hamilton was in George Russell's position by the time he catches Norris and Sainz to try and get the win, they're of the opinion that he would have won that race. Do you guys share that opinion? If Lewis was in Russell's position, would he have won today?
I think it would be more likely that Lewis would have won if he was in George's position. Obviously, that comes with a lot more experience as a driver, and obviously being the 7-time world champion that Lewis is, and where George is in a different point of his career. So you do have to take that caveat. But I think Lewis would have won the race if he was in that position. You think when they came out of the pits, Lewis was over 5 seconds behind George, and he closed it up rate of knots as well. So in that tyre, he had the greater pace than George at that point. So he could have given himself a couple more laps before he arrived in the scene at an earlier place anyway. So there's a lot of obviously what ifs, but I think it would have been more likely if there may be some team orders or switch around or something. But I'm not saying the Mercedes should have done that, but I think it would have probably increased their chances of winning.
Maybe. What do you reckon, Courtney?
Yeah, I think you made a great point there, Lee, about how George was 5 seconds ahead at one point. I can't help but feel, I've said that phrase a lot tonight, I can't help but feel that George, took a lot more life out of his tyres whilst trying to catch Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz, obviously Charles Leclerc along the way. I think there was an adrenaline rush there. I think the situation we've had this season did also play a part, be it a small part. we all know how dominant Red Bull have been this season, and I can't help but feel that there was almost a little bit of desperation within these drivers to get that race win, because it's the first chance since, as you said, Adam, Brazil last season, that anyone other than Max Verstappen or Sergio Perez have had to win a race. So you saw it with Carlos Sainz dealt with it in his own way, but he pulled out all the stops to get that race win, whereas George thought he's handed the golden chalice to take that said opportunity. And I just felt there was almost a little bit too much desperation. He took a bit too much life out of his tyres, and when they all come close together, it was obvious that Lewis had a lot more grip in his tyres compared to George Russell. So again, that's another lesson that George needs to learn from this.
Yeah, it's a very harsh lesson, but I'm sure one that will make George Russell a better driver going forward. And I think you're right to point that out with George Russell this weekend, especially in the race. There were plenty of radio conversations that we could see between George and the Mercedes engineers, and it did feel a lot of it was trying to rein in a prized horse that really just wants to be let off the reins and go after, the opposition. And Mercedes were like, no, it's okay. We've got the strategy. We're managing this. Don't worry, we'll have the pace. Of course, the safety cars did try and change the dynamic in that regard. But you're probably right. And I was saying this when I was watching this, that whilst George was impressive to catch Lando and Carlos in the manner that he did and at the rate that he did, you could argue that by the time he got there, he left himself with one opportunity to try and make that move, and it didn't happen. And after that, it did look all the while that those two had him covered off. With Hamilton, I don't know personally if Hamilton would have won today if he was in Russell's position at that point in time. I think perhaps you're right. He probably would have been more likely to than George in that regard. But we've got to remember here, Lando Norris, and we're going to talk about him in a bit more detail in a bit, he very much was the key to this result today, and his defensive driving was incredible. We saw this at Silverstone as well with Sir Lewis Hamilton, how we all thought he was going to overtake Lando at Silverstone. Lando fended him off in that early stage, and it was very tight between them. But of course, after he'd done that, he hadn't beat all ends up. And, we can move on to Lando whilst we're here on this subject. But again, another incredible performance from Lando Norris. I think he would probably agree, and McLaren too, that whilst they were in the mix, they were probably the least favourite out of those four to win the Grand Prix. That being said, another drive from Lando where he has practically zero errors. I think you could argue him and Sainz were the only two that really did zero errors in the entire race, and yet despite the ailments and perhaps disadvantage he had compared to those two other cars, it's another great P2 and brilliant defensive driving again. So I think once again we've got to lay praise on Lando Norris, who is again and again and again finding new ways to impress an audience of F1 fans and F1 followers alike that are really starting to take notice of how special this kid really, really is.
Yeah, he's a brilliant driver, and obviously McLaren know how good he is. He showed it today, and that's why McLaren have to deliver the car long term to keep him, because other teams will want him. He showed today why other teams have such a high interest in him. And it was just a brilliant drive. Obviously, he felt hard done by at the start with Lewis not giving him back the place. But once Lewis had given back the place, Lando was on it. He was in the mix. There were chances that you think, could he actually get Carlos? Because he was always hovering in that window, and it's like, all you just need is that one mistake from Carlos, and we may have a surprise McLaren victory, which have been really enjoyable. Lando's first. He was just all on it, and I really look forward to the performance that upgraded McLaren can actually deliver in Suzuka.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the maturity of his driving for someone so young, and in a way carefree and happy-go-lucky with the fans. And we've said for a long time that Lando Norris perhaps needs to be less, what's the right word? Less, or more mature, I suppose, in how he talks to the paddock and the pundits and the fans, and it's a very harsh criticism, and I don't think it's one that's probably well warranted right now. But when things were difficult, perhaps that may have been a fair one. But he's still the same character he always has been. He stayed true to that. But his racecraft and his ability behind the wheel, the speed that he has and natural talent. This is a guy that very much is showing everybody what he can do and how impressive he is. And it does feel, Courtney, that it's only a matter of time when all the stars will align for Lando Norris and he will eventually get his first F1 win.
I was going to say, a race win is one thing. It's going to be a weird thing to say about someone that hasn't won a race yet. But I personally believe that Lando Norris is now ready to challenge for a championship. I think now he's shown that level of consistency and, as you said, Adam, maturity to truly challenge. I feel that Lando and his entourage are going to have some very important decisions to make in the next season or so. I think McLaren are showing signs of improvement. I'm really hoping this continues into next season. But you look at the other teams, when Sergio Perez leaves, you probably say that Lando Norris will be one of the favourites to go into the Red Bull seat. Or when Lewis retires in a couple seasons' time, given where Mercedes go in the next couple of years, will Lando Norris will be one of the drivers linked with the Mercedes seat. So I think he's going to be a very sought after driver, but you just need to look back. I always use Fernando Alonso as the biggest example of how your career choices can define, your accolades. Obviously, you got the 2 championship wins with Renault, but at the same time, the decisions that Fernando Alonso made he probably robbed himself of opportunities to winning 3, 4, maybe even 5, 6 or 7 championships. So Lando Norris I feel that the move that Lando Norris makes in next year or so, or whether he stays at McLaren, could be career defining. But I have no doubt in my mind, we've had conversations, we've done episodes about in the past, who's going to be carrying the flag for the UK when Lewis retires. And if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said George Russell, based on the fact that when they raced, him and Lando raced against each other in F2, George Russell had the upper hand. He had a fantastic season. But I can't help but feel, again, that Lando Norris has developed a lot more as a driver compared to George Russell. And yeah, I feel that if they were both in the championship battle next season against Max, I'd give Lando Norris a better chance compared to George.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more with that one. And I think that's a good place to end on Norris and talk about Oscar Piastri briefly. Of course, we didn't really get to see much of Oscar Piastri today, owing to the fact that he was so far down the field. And of course, there was a lot of interest at the battle for the race win, of course, given that Max Verstappen wasn't really a factor. So, of course, all eyes were glued on that developing battle to see who our newest race winner for 2023 was going to be. But Oscar Piastri, the weekend didn't start great for him. Obviously, Lando got a lot of the upgrades, which obviously helped McLaren. I'm sure Piastri's going to get those very, very soon. But qualifying was very much hampered when the track was ramping up. Of course, Lance Stroll's accident brought out the red flag, and Piastri was the first driver to approach Stroll's car, and it really ruined his qualifying efforts. But at the end of the day, I think given the situation Piastri found himself in, if someone would have offered him a P7 after how this weekend had gone, I think he would have very much bit your hand off for that one. So when you assess the whole weekend, I think you just got to look at the race performance. Again, not many mistakes, just keeping your nose clean. And he got some good championship points on the board. And at the end of the day, when you look at the current standings at the moment, whilst McLaren were originally chasing down the likes of Ferrari, who have very much gotten away from them, Aston Martin is still a bit away now. I think the gap is, 78 points between the two. But Aston Martin didn't score today. And McLaren managed to bag, 24 points? So as this season draws to a close, if we get more weekends like we saw this weekend, there's every chance that points like that from Piastri will make a world of difference for McLaren.
Yeah, and you think Oscar, you saw after the race in the interviews, Oscar is really excited about getting the upgrades next time out. And he knows that, or he believes he's equal or better than Lando. Obviously, all drivers think they're better than everybody else. That's part of their mentality.
Unless you're Perez.
But No comment.
Sorry, I had to throw it in there, but go on.
He's going to be looking forward to running those upgrades, and you just having both those McLarens, they are sharp into the grid. Having Lando was on his own today; he had no one to back him up. Obviously, Carlos had Charles, George had Lewis, but Lando was just there. He had no backup. There was no strategy play. But having them both up there, the potential McLaren strategy, they could really not manipulate, create situations for themselves that can deliver maximum results. And Aston Martin's been a bit lost in performance. They could easily overhaul that 78-point gap on over the rest of the remaining races of the season.
Yeah, I don't think there's much more we can say on that one right now. The battle very much seems to be on between McLaren and Aston Martin. McLaren clearly have two drivers that can score regular points for them. Piastri, on a difficult weekend, still managed to get some good points, whereas Aston Martin looked like they were in a better position with Alonso, and he came away with nothing. So it's very much on for those two. And as you rightly pointed out, Lee, Piastri very much looking forward to getting those upgrades on his car. Could prove to be a game changer for McLaren in the final third of the F1 World Championship of 2023. Let's move on now to Red Bull. 40 minutes into this podcast now, and this is the first proper mention of Red Bull other than the part in the intro, and for good reason. Very difficult weekend for Red Bull, and I know some people already going out there already saying, oh, the new technical directive TD18, tightening up the grey areas on flexi wings. Of course, you know, we all know, even people that don't understand the tech side of F1 know that you can't have completely stiff, rigid wings because they'll just break under the loads of modern F1 cars. The laws of physics just don't allow it. So there's always going to be room for those to flex a little bit within the tolerances. But the FIA clearing up some grey area and some potential loopholes there. Overall, I don't think it makes a blind bit of difference to Red Bull's overall performance, even though people are going to try and connect the dots and suggest that it may have done. But is this simply just a weekend for Red Bull where they just have to learn what went wrong, try and figure things out, brush it off, and just go again next weekend in Japan? Or the weekend after, sorry.
Yeah, I do feel that you can't judge the performance on the technical directive change. Obviously, you got to give it a race or two to see if that has impacted at all. I would add a caveat that if the FIA are clamping down on flexi wings, which they have done for several years, there's normally a team taking advantage of that to force the clampdown. I'm not saying that's Red Bull. I'm just saying that's normally the reason why the FIA start policing these things harder, because there's been accusations made. But what I think has probably happened to Red Bull this weekend is they bought their floor edge upgrades that didn't really bring performance through practice, and then they were a bit lost on their setup because they didn't have enough time to set up the car with the old floor edges for the remainder of the weekend, which is where they lost their performance. But obviously it was a brilliant recovery drive from Max, which you, based on the qualifying performance, you really didn't think he would be finishing in that position by the end of the race.
Yeah, and of course, for clarity on the flexi wings debate, the rumours were in the paddock that Aston Martin were the team that were potentially taking more liberties than others in that regard, not Red Bull. So, but even then, you know, it's completely unfounded and it's just smoke and mirrors and rumours and such. So you can't really take too much into it. Not that I think it makes a massive amount of difference, this new technical directive, but of course, it does seem to be a step in the right direction. But yeah, Courtney, it was a strange one for Max Verstappen this weekend. Knocked out in Q2 by Liam Lawson, of all people, the Red Bull junior driver at AlphaTauri at the moment, who's doing a fine job, and we'll talk about him in a moment. I believe it was the first time we didn't get a Red Bull at all in Q3 since Russia 2018. Long time ago, given how good and consistent Red Bull have been. But given how bad things were for Red Bull, particularly in the middle of the race when their strategy to go long on the hards was completely ruined by that early safety car, arguably perhaps their one opportunity that they could have had if it went their way to try and win this race, the fact that Max Verstappen still finished P5 and very nearly caught Charles Leclerc as well, I don't think that's too bad when all things considered. If you're going to have a bad weekend like Red Bull and Max had in particular, I don't think that's a disaster by their lofty standards.
Look, of course, it's not a disaster for them. They've got both championships wrapped up. It's just a matter of when that happens. But They will be gutted. I think Max in the interview afterwards was when he asked, your perfect record that Red Bull were clearly after. Obviously that's not possible anymore. And he said, how do you feel about it? And he said, I don't care about stats. But sorry, I don't believe that. I definitely
They all
believe...
say that, don't they?
Exactly. He cared about the stats last week when he got 10 wins in a row, but now he doesn't care about the stats anymore. Of course they care about the stats. They've lost the perfect record. So yes, they will be gutted about that. But I have no doubt in my mind that come Suzuka, they'll be back to their same old setting purples wherever they can, probably win by 20 seconds. But what I will say is, if Red Bull do struggle in Suzuka, then that is when eyebrows will start to raise. And look, I'm not gonna lie. If there's a slight chance of it happening, I hope it does, because as I said at the beginning of the episode, if the other teams are starting to close in on Red Bull, I think we do need to keep an eye on McLaren in the coming races with the upgrades that they got. They're saying that McLaren, the upgrades could give them up to 3-4 tenths a second a lap. Could we be seeing more challenges for race wins? I do believe that Red Bull could easily go on to win every single race for the rest of the season. But I am hoping we're starting to see the other teams close in, because as I said at the beginning of the episode, if we have some of these drivers challenging Mac for a championship next season, 2024 would be a fantastic one.
Yeah, very much so. And I must admit, as unpopular as it might sound, I was actually a little bit disappointed that this perfect run that Red Bull were on didn't go a bit further, just to see out of curiosity if they could have gone the whole season perfect. That being said, when Carlos Sainz was the one that broke it and won for Ferrari, I forgot about that and I was absolutely buzzing. So, never mind. But, it's a shame for them that it has come to a halt. But of course, as you rightly pointed out, guys, I think this is just one of those where they have to just take the pain for 1 week. We had this with Mercedes when they were dominant. There was always 1 or 2 races in the season where they were going to suffer.
It was
and
Singapore,
they did.
interestingly.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the circuit. Although, in fairness to them, they won a few races despite all of that. When those, so that just shows when the team is that good and the drivers are on it, they can still overcome these things. Perez, on the other hand, P8, was in the wars a little bit, it must be said, particularly later on in the race. There was a moment where he had a collision with Albon where he just completely T-boned him. It's like, get out the way, I'm coming through, like the Eddie Hearn meme, if you like. For those who remember that. Got a 5-second time penalty for that. Not that it really mattered, because he didn't lose a place for that. And he was also involved in the incident with Tsunoda at the start of the race, which abruptly ended his Grand Prix, which I'm surprised nobody really mentioned, or the stewards didn't even notice that. But it just confirms it was a very difficult weekend for Red Bull, on the track at least. Off the track, of course, we'll get into that momentarily. But tough one all round for Red Bull, Perez included.
Yeah, it was very tough one for Sergio. He did some interesting overtakes. I'm not going to lie on that. But yeah, I think they were a lot messier than the finesse that we know he can do. I think it was just a lot more driving on the edge, and he just clearly was not comfortable in that car this weekend.
Yeah, very much so. Quick one on the news following the comments made by Dr. Helmut Marko. Of course, we talked about this at great length in the preview, so we're not going to go into that too much. The FIA and F1, of course, they responded by giving Helmut Marko a written warning, reminding him of the FIA Code of Ethics. Now, as far as I'm aware, it's the first time we've ever seen anyone in the paddock be given a written warning regarding their behaviour or comments that have been made. Christian Horner was approached for comment on this, and he very much reiterated that Helmut Marko, whilst involved at Red Bull, and in a director capacity, of course, is not technically an employee of the Red Bull racing team. Now, I'm not going to try and pick apart Christian Horner's comments, but whilst technically, from a company structure standpoint, he is correct, he's still very much involved with the Red Bull team and the Red Bull brand. And, I was a little bit surprised that Red Bull, the racing element, didn't really comment on those comments, other than when the brand issued the apology from Dr. Helmut Marko. So it was a bit surprising there. But what do you guys reckon? As difficult as a topic as this can be, and I appreciate that it is for a lot of people. Is the written warning the right action for the FIA? I mean, it's better than nothing at least, and that has been the norm in the past at least.
Yeah, we said in the preview that we believe that the Formula One or the FIA should make a statement, make it clear that this behaviour is not acceptable, which they have done. So we have to be happy that they've done that. If it's enough, I'm not too sure. I think it isn't. But as you said, in the past, the FIA have done nothing. There's been no action. So in that sense, it is an improvement. But yeah, just obviously hope it's not a repeat offence in the future.
Hope so. And Sergio Perez as well apparently had forgiven him for those comments as well. So I guess, Courtney, hopefully we can move on from this, and hopefully this sort of thing doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I think that's the whole point. We said this quite often when it comes to Helmut Marko. He just seems to, he has a knack of saying these things, and you get the same old excuses saying, he's old school, this, that, and the other. But as you said, that we spoke about in a preview. But I feel that when Toto Wolff was asked about it, I think he put it perfectly that F1 has put in a lot of effort. Obviously, with Lewis Hamilton and the Mercedes team, Mercedes in particular, a lot of time and resources have gone in to, highlight the social issues within F1 in particular, because we know that to this day there are massive social issues in F1 that actually limits the opportunities that drivers from certain backgrounds or wealth have to get into the sport. So for, someone in a high position at the championship winning team, the dominant team, for someone that high up to be making those remarks is terrible PR, not only for Red Bull, but for F1 as a sport in general. So for some kind of action to be made, you both said it's better than nothing. But I can't help but feel this isn't the end of the story. It's only a matter of time. Let's say next season you have a championship battle where Lewis Hamilton is involved. You get into the heat of the moment. Max and Lewis come together, have a few disagreements. That Helmut Marko is going to end up saying something. So, yeah, I'm glad something has been done, but I'm just waiting for him to do it again, to be honest.
Yeah, that is a concern for some fans that have reacted to this. I mean, it's one of those situations where I've had to try and, and make sure that I listen to people that are affected by these issues, and understand that the position I am in is, and people can see when they watch us on YouTube the kind of position that I come in when it comes to stuff like this. I feel like there should be a capacity where we have to listen to those that are affected by these and try to understand from their perspective as best as we can. The consensus from a lot of people from different demographics that are affected by these issues seems to be that they are glad that a precedent has been set to a certain degree, but of course this has to be followed up with a no-tolerance policy now that this precedent has been set, that any repeats of these language or behaviours or these archaic views, as Lewis Hamilton once described them, can no longer go unpunished. So hopefully we can move forward with this and, these things don't come up again. But of course, as you said, Courtney, we'll just have to wait and see if this precedent does have an effect. Let's move on to let's talk about Alpine briefly, because they were very much in the mix today. Gasly, of course, managed to get P6. Esteban Ocon very much was leading the charge outside the top guys, being the best of the rest. Unfortunately, his race come to an abrupt end, which brought out the virtual safety car. How would you make Alpine's day today? Probably a bittersweet when you think about it.
Yeah, for me, I was disappointed that Ocon didn't finish because he was my best of the rest prediction.
It was mine too. I was gutted.
Courtney got it right on that one.
You did, yeah. Well, you're probably smart to go with Alpine. It was going to be one or the other, but I mean, I can't argue with how the race played out because obviously, Ferrari won. But I did feel for Ocon. He definitely deserved better today.
Yeah, it's not a pleasant way to go out, but they can take hope there was a good performance from the car through the weekend. And that obviously that's a take out and you take to the next race.
Yeah, very much so. Courtney, Pierre Gasly, again, since the summer break, Alpine have upped their game to a degree, but Gasly in particular, last couple of races, he's been in the mix with some points. Are we starting to see Gasly finally be at one at this Alpine team and start to take this team, hopefully going forward in the direction they want to?
Yeah, we've spoken a lot in this episode about, taking golden opportunities when they don't come often. I think that the fact that we describe the Alpine situation as Alpine land, which you so kindly started there, Lee, it is a fantastic analogy. So when those opportunities come, they need to take them, and I feel they've got two consistent drivers there who do tend to take them. Hence why they are in Alpine land, rather than if their drivers were making a lot of mistakes, they would probably find themselves in the battle with the likes of Haas, Alfa Romeo, or even Williams. So I do feel that Alpine's struggles this season have actually sort of don't look as bad because both of their drivers have been fairly consistent.
Yeah, very much so. Very unlucky with Ocon. I think he deserved a lot better today, and it could have been a very nice haul for Alpine. But as it was, only Gasly picking up some points for them, and hopefully for Ocon, his luck will be better in the next round. But the form is definitely improving for Alpine. Whilst they are in that Alpine land, or no man's land, as some people would like to say, they are very much in the fight more often now after the summer break than they were beforehand. So good to see that. Let's move on to AlphaTauri, of course. Yuki Tsunoda very unlucky this weekend, taken out earlier on in the race, so there wasn't really much we could comment on him. Obviously bogged down a bit in qualifying too. The story is very much about Liam Lawson, and Liam Lawson made the headlines after his third race in Formula 1, knocking out the world champion, the driver that had won 10 races in a row in Q2 with an incredible lap in the sister junior Red Bull team. And then he consolidates that with another incredible performance, better than the last, to get some big points for AlphaTauri, which could be pivotal in the fight for what is P9 at the moment in the Constructors' Championship. Now, that might not seem glamorous, but of course, not finishing last would certainly be an achievement for AlphaTauri, considering where they were at the start of the summer break. But Liam Lawson, I mean, this guy is continuing to impress at the moment to such degree where, as I said, myself and I think a lot of people are starting to argue a case for him that if Ricciardo returns and is fit and healthy in the next few weeks or few races, Lawson should still keep this seat and maybe be in that seat for 2024. What do you guys reckon? Is Liam Lawson ready for a permanent seat?
I really do believe that Williams should be keeping an eye on this situation. As you said, Adam, it's a really awkward situation because Daniel Ricciardo wasn't doing a bad job. He's got the injury, obviously out of his control, but Liam Lawson has come along and done a grand job. And one of those drivers isn't going to have a seat next season, and actually both of them do. So if you're Williams, I'm sorry, Logan Sargent binned it again today. I think his time at Williams is done. And you've got two drivers there who would actually do a really good job for Williams. So obviously I think AlphaTauri need to make a decision as soon as possible and not let this drag on. I do believe that Lawson will be out of his seat for the rest of the season. But let's say Daniel comes in, regardless of how it goes, I think Williams should be looking at one of those drivers for next season.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because right now, based on what we've seen this season, in theory, Yuki Tsunoda should be a no-brainer for AlphaTauri to stay on. But there are the connections with Honda. There have been the rumours about a potential opportunity at Aston Martin in the future. So it does create a scenario where instead of it being an argument for Lawson or Ricciardo for 2024, it could end up being a case for Lawson and Ricciardo for 2024. It very much depends on what Red Bull see for their short to medium-term options with the team. But right now, Lee, I mean, maybe it's me, trying to argue this case for Liam Lawson, and maybe I'm over-egging this guy. But I just can't see right now that if Lawson continues to do what he's doing, whether you go with Ricciardo or Tsunoda that's going to be with him, you can't argue that Lawson doesn't deserve to be in an F1 seat next season.
Well, firstly, I want to say that, yes, another brilliant drive from Lawson. It was really showing he deserves to be in Formula One. He's got given the opportunity. He's taken it with both hands and going, look, I deserve to be here. I'm not disputing that. But if you believe the current rumor mill that's going around, Yuki Tsunoda is probably one of the unsafest seats in Formula One right now. The rumors are that Red Bull are thinking about a Liam and Daniel team for next year because of those Honda connections. Obviously, the growing Ford connections with the Red Bull powertrains. And it'll be Yuki be the one on the chopping block. Obviously, it's only a rumor, but as I've said before, with Formula One rumors, when there's a rumor, there's normally some basis in the truth to start that rumor. Yuki's been doing some great performances. Obviously, he's had some bad luck this year, but Daniel's couple of races were very good as well. As you both alluded to, it's a bit of an unfortunate mess that they found themselves in, but I think Yuki, unfortunately, may find himself on the loser in the coming races or into next season even.
Yeah. And if you follow WTF1, you will know that this all started with Alex Albon getting appendicitis last year. And if you want to connect the dots, go to their page and you'll see exactly why. But overall, it's a crazy situation with AlphaTauri and Red Bull. And ultimately, it looks like Red Bull are going to be the ones that make that decision. But yes, crazy as it sounds, because of the connections with Honda, because of what's gone on there and Honda now lining with Aston Martin for 2026, there could be a scenario here that seems to be more likely by the week that Liam Lawson could not be replacing Ricciardo. He could be replacing Yuki Tsunoda. It's mad to think, but that could become a possibility. But great to see Liam Lawson do a great job, and I'm loving the fact that he's getting this opportunity. I've been crying for this guy to get an opportunity, and it looks like he's finally taken it. Hope that continues. I'd be very surprised if Ricciardo ends up in that car next time out in Japan, because this is a circuit that Lawson knows very well from his Super Formula campaign this season, which of course I think he's still got to finish. So I don't know how they're going to fit all of that in, but remains to be seen. Quick one on Haas. Of course, we don't talk about them very often on these race reviews, and for good reason, because they have been a team that has struggled a lot this season, mostly because they've been great in qualifying, but they fall massively down the pecking order because of the issues with their car on a Sunday. But Kevin Magnussen got in the points, and by Haas's standards this season, I think that is almost a win for them, getting a point on the board. Currently, 8th in the Constructors' Championship? It's still very, very tight at the moment, but for Haas to get that extra point to stretch their advantage over Alfa Romeo and possibly AlphaTauri as well, that could be a very lucrative championship point. So, kudos to Magnussen, kudos to Haas. They did a good job this weekend.
Yeah, look, it's good for them to get those points on the board, particularly given how close it is towards the very bottom. But it just goes back to a point I've made quite a while back. I'm just disappointed that Haas aren't aiming higher. But it is what it is, and given the situation that they're in, it is a good result that the fallback wasn't as extreme at this circuit as it has been other circuits in the last year or so when they've actually qualified quite well.
Yeah, very true. And Lee, of course, quick one on Kevin Magnussen. As I said, this is a driver who's going to be with the team next season from what we understand, but that being said, despite being beaten all ends up by Hulkenberg for most of the season, I think a result like today is just to remind Haas that he very much is still capable of getting the results that they need.
Oh, definitely. Obviously, we've said before about the disparity between Nico and Kevin, that Nico seems to be better in qualifying and Kevin seems to bring the result back when Nico falls back. And it's just another example where these two drivers work quite well together as teammates. They complement each other in their strengths of Nico seems to be better in qualifying. Kevin seems to deliver the results in the race, although Nico is still obviously very good in the race, bringing back the points as well. I'm not going to say he's not. But they seem to be quite a harmonious relationship between the two. And Kevin, again, is just reminding Haas that don't forget about me. Although I've got a seat, I still can do the job. And I think it's very important points that Kevin scored today.
Yeah, very much so. Of course, quick note on Alfa Romeo. No points for them today, but Zhou Guanyu confirmed to be with the team for 2024. That news broke literally hours after the preview podcast was released, as typical as it is with us. As soon as we nailed on with something, the opposite happened. So what do we know? But good for him. But is it the right decision for Alfa Romeo? Because, of course, they have a driver in Théo Pourchaire leading the F2 Championship. And whilst he's not been convincingly dominant in this season's championship, and I wouldn't exactly say it's been the highest caliber of field when we compared to some previous seasons, he's going to be gutted, isn't he, Théo Pourchaire? And that Alfa Romeo have decided not to give him that opportunity and keep Zhou Guanyu on for another season.
Yeah, it's tough on Théo Pourchaire, but at the same time, I feel that Zhou Guanyu, if you look through his almost 2 years now at Alfa Romeo, he's actually done a good job for them. I originally thought that he was just there for the money to start with, and obviously the marketing part of it because he's Chinese. But he's done a very good job for the team, and it's harsh on Pourchaire, but it also will have been very harsh on Zhou Guanyu to lose a seat in F1 altogether.
What do you reckon, Lee? Has Zhou done enough, in your opinion, to deserve an extension with the team?
Yeah, as I said in the preview, I think he's done enough to keep his seat. He's been very equal to his teammate, more or less throughout the season with Valtteri. Obviously, sometimes he's been behind Valtteri, sometimes he's been ahead of Valtteri, but they're more or less quite similar performance on their cars. So I think he's deserved to keep his seat, because you can only base yourself against your teammate, especially if your car isn't that good. Unfortunately for Alfa Romeo. But as I said, I know they haven't announced anything, but I do think the Audi deal is another reason why he's managed to keep his seat, because they don't want to rock the boat, don't want to do all the changes while they work in the background of building up the Audi plan, whatever that plan is.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And, you know, as I said, I like Théo Pourchaire. I do rate him fairly highly, but I think we can all agree, anyone that's followed the F2 Championship this season, he's not exactly set the world alight this season in the same way that perhaps Oscar Piastri did 2 years ago, for example. So, you know, those are the high standards that you've got to kind of go for. But that being said, you know, other drivers that didn't set the world alight in F2, Pierre Gasly comes to mind, has built a pretty solid F1 career for himself. So all hope is not lost for Théo Pourchaire. I mean, just ask Felipe Drugovich, who would have hoped to try and get an F1 seat this season or next season. That doesn't look like it's going to happen. And, you know, it's hard to get on the F1 grid right now. You really have to showcase that you are something special. And I think we can all agree last season, Drugovich, he completely dominated F2 last season compared to this season. And he's still not able to get an F1 seat. So very, very tough crowd right now. But Zhou staying on with Alfa Romeo. Speaking of Aston Martin, I think we need to end the episode talking about them. Fernando Alonso could have been some points for him this weekend, but not really fortunate with the car. It was really struggling from the get-go. And his race was abruptly cut short because of a suspension issue. Probably the only highlight for Fernando Alonso this weekend is Carlos Sainz winning the race.
Yeah, it was just a really messy race from Aston Martin across both drivers. Obviously, the unfortunate incident Lance had, and obviously he wasn't feeling well enough to race today. Fernando looked like he was steady in it at the beginning. He was hovering thereabouts, but as they upped the pace, the Aston Martin gap got bigger and bigger, and then that pit stop, and obviously their eventual retirement. It's just, I hope the rest of their season isn't like this weekend, because it'd be a shame to see them fall so far backwards regarding the highs they had at the start of the season.
Yeah, I mean, Aston Martin put that down to an issue with the suspension on the left-hand side. One of the housing arms was having a bit of an issue, which cost him some performance, and ultimately that did prevent him from finishing the Grand Prix. Go to Lance Stroll, of course. He had the big crash at the end of Q1. Fortunately, Lance did seem to be okay, albeit very, very shaken up. It was a very nasty crash. So to see him walk away, especially after the injuries he suffered before the season had started, was very, very welcoming indeed. But I think it sums up how things are for Aston Martin right now. Their form has completely plummeted. You know, I don't want to lay too much criticism on Lance Stroll because of what happened to him this weekend. But, you know, we're in a situation with Aston Martin where they were riding high, but their season does seem to be derailed by the fact that when things are difficult, they've only really got one driver that they can rely on at the moment in Fernando Alonso. And I think not having that reliable number 2 scoring points on a regular basis really is hurting them a lot.
Yeah, we raised it quite early on in the season when Fernando was regularly appearing on the podium, and most of the time Lance Stroll was nowhere to be seen. We did say that this could cost them towards the end of the season, because we know that Aston Martin, and obviously they were formerly Racing Point Force India, traditionally come fast out the blocks, and then they usually get out developed by the rivals. So they had to take maximum opportunities. Lance Stroll didn't deliver for the team, and yeah, it looks like Lance Stroll's performances are going to cost Aston Martin dearly. They could be the difference between finishing third and finishing fifth.
Yeah, still a healthy margin between them and McLaren. And McLaren, if those upgrades on Piastri do prove to be as good as they were for Lando, it could be something for them to keep an eye on at Aston Martin, because this is a team that looked like they were best of the rest. They were fighting Mercedes and Ferrari for P2. Both of those teams have overhauled them and now built up a gap. And they're going to be looking over their shoulders more likely at McLaren behind them. And if they were to finish the season 5th behind McLaren after how strong they were at the start, I think they will be massively disappointed. But of course, you know, they can be forensic as they like. I think, again, whilst I don't want to just throw shade at the guy after what happened to him this weekend, I think we can all agree that it could be mitigated if he would been able to pick up more points when the car was in a stronger position. But hopefully he makes a good recovery. Obviously, 2 weeks now until the next Grand Prix in Japan, in front of their new suitors at Honda, so I'm sure Aston Martin will be hoping to make a comeback and a return to form. So I think that's all we've got time for in this episode. We'll be back with a different kind of episode this week, as there's no Grand Prix weekend, and of course we'll have the Japanese Grand Prix preview coming up the week afterwards. But let us know in the comment section your thoughts on the race this weekend, and of course your thoughts on the topics that we discussed. We'd love to hear your opinion. We'd love to get your feedback in the comment section. It's always great to interact with you guys on all things Formula 1. Of course, if you like the video, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget, if you listen to us on your favourite audio podcasting platform, to leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us out a lot, and of course, get involved in the conversation on YouTube as well. But until next time, thanks for tuning in. Please stay safe as always, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.
See you soon.
Goodbye.